Before that night, the restaurant was simply my workplace. Nothing about it felt dramatic or important. It was just a place where people came to eat, talk loudly, and leave their problems outside for a while. At least that was how I used to see it. The building itself was narrow and warm, with low golden lights hanging over each table. From the outside, it looked elegant, the kind of place where couples celebrated anniversaries and business people held quiet dinners. Inside, it was always busy. I had been working there for almost 2 years. At first, I believed I was lucky to have the job. The restaurant had a good reputation in the city, and the tips could be generous on weekends. I was never the loudest waitress or the most confident one, but I worked carefully. I listened more than I spoke. Most of my coworkers were different. They were fast, loud, and confident with customers. They joked with each other in the kitchen, sometimes too loudly, and they often guessed what kind of tip a customer would leave the moment they walked through the door. "Watch the shoes," one waiter once told me during my first month. "Shoes tell you everything." I did not understand what he meant at first. Later, I realized he was serious. In that restaurant, people were judged quickly. Expensive clothes meant better tables. Confident voices meant faster service. Foreign accents sometimes meant impatience from the staff. No one wrote these rules down, but everyone seemed to understand them. The manager encouraged it without saying it directly. His name was Victor. He was the kind of man who smiled widely in front of wealthy guests but spoke sharply to the staff when customers were not listening. He controlled the room with small gestures, pointing toward a table, nodding toward a waiter, raising an eyebrow when something annoyed him. If Victor believed a table would spend a lot of money, that table received immediate attention. If he believed the opposite, the service slowed down. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but after months of watching the same patterns repeat, it became impossible to ignore. Still, I rarely said anything. Part of it was my personality. I had always been quiet. Even as a child, I preferred observing conversations rather than joining them. Working as a waitress forced me to speak more than I usually would, but I still kept most of my thoughts to myself. And honestly, the restaurant did not feel cruel. Not openly. Most nights were simple. Orders were taken, plates were delivered, and customers left satisfied. My coworkers joked with each other while cleaning tables, and the kitchen staff played music when the rush slowed down. It felt like an ordinary workplace. When small, uncomfortable moments happened, an impatient comment toward a tourist, a joke about someone's accent, they passed quickly. No one argued. No one made it serious. The room simply moved on. I told myself that was normal. Every workplace had small flaws. Every group of coworkers had habits that were not perfect. So I kept working, kept observing, and kept trusting that nothing truly important was happening beneath the surface. At that time, I believed the restaurant was just another place where people worked, earned money, and went home at the end of the night. I did not yet understand how quickly a quiet evening could reveal something much heavier. The first uncomfortable moments were small enough that most people would have ignored them. In fact, most people did. The restaurant followed the same rhythm every evening. Customers arrived, coats were taken, menus were placed on the tables, and the noise of conversations slowly filled the room. From the outside, everything looked professional and smooth. But when you worked inside the room long enough, you began to notice patterns. Victor usually stood near the entrance during busy hours. He watched every person who walked through the door with the same quick, measuring look. It was subtle, but after months of working there, I understood what he was doing. He was deciding. Deciding who mattered and who did not. One evening, a young couple entered the restaurant. Their clothes were simple, and they looked slightly nervous as if it was their first time in a place like ours. Victor greeted them politely, but he guided them toward one of the smaller tables near the back wall. 10 minutes later, another couple arrived. They were louder, dressed in expensive coats, and they walked with a confidence that filled the entrance. Victor's reaction was immediate. His smile widened, and he personally led them to a table near the window, the kind of table people often requested in advance. No one said anything about it. The waiters simply adjusted their schedules, making sure the second couple received faster service. Moments like that happened often. Another night, a group of tourists sat near the center of the restaurant. Their English was slow and careful. They studied the menu for several minutes, whispering to each other before calling a waiter for help. One of my coworkers returned to the kitchen afterward and laughed quietly. "They will be here for 2 hours and order the cheapest dishes," he said. A few people smiled. I remember standing near the coffee machine, holding 2 empty glasses, pretending I had not heard him. The tourists themselves were polite. They thanked the staff every time a plate arrived. When they struggled to pronounce the names of certain dishes, they apologized. Still, the service around their table moved more slowly than usual. No one was openly rude. Plates were delivered, drinks were refilled, and the customers were treated with basic politeness. But something about the atmosphere around them felt different, a kind of quiet impatience. I began noticing other small moments too. A raised eyebrow when someone asked too many questions. A sigh when a customer took too long to decide on an order. These things were never loud enough to become a real conflict. They were just there. When I mentioned it once to another waitress during a break, she shrugged. "That is how restaurants work," she said. "Some customers are easier than others." Her voice was calm, as if the subject was not important enough to think about deeply. Maybe she was right. After all, no one was being openly insulted. No arguments were happening in the dining room. The guests still ate their meals and left the restaurant without complaints. From the outside, everything looked normal. But the more evenings I spent watching these small decisions unfold, the more I felt a quiet discomfort I could not explain. It was not loud enough to challenge, not serious enough to confront, just a feeling that something about the way people were treated depended on things that had nothing to do with respect. At the time, I still believed those moments were harmless. I had no reason to think they would lead to anything larger. The man arrived on a quiet evening. It was not the busiest night of the week, but the restaurant was still full enough that every table mattered. The sound of conversations filled the room, and the kitchen was moving steadily behind the swinging doors. I was carrying a tray of drinks when the entrance door opened. At first, nothing about him seemed unusual. He walked in alone, closed the door gently behind him, and paused for a moment as his eyes adjusted to the warm lighting inside the restaurant. His clothes were simple dark jacket, plain shirt, nothing that stood out. He did not look like someone trying to impress anyone. Victor noticed him almost immediately. The manager always watched the door, but this time his reaction was different. It was subtle, the kind of expression that disappeared quickly, but I still saw it. A brief look of disinterest crossed his face. Victor approached the man with a polite but distant smile. "Table for one?" he asked. The man nodded. There were several good tables still available near the center of the restaurant, but Victor did not offer any of them. Instead, he guided the man toward a small corner table near the back wall. It was not a terrible seat, but it was one we usually reserved for customers who arrived late without reservations. The man did not complain. He simply sat down and placed his hands calmly on the table while Victor handed him a menu. Then Victor returned to the front of the restaurant without another word. A few minutes later, I heard one of the waiters whisper near the service station. "Looks like a quiet night for that table," he said. Another waiter glanced toward the corner and shrugged. "Probably just passing through the city." They laughed softly before returning to their work. I tried to focus on my own tables, but something about the situation kept pulling my attention back toward the corner of the room. The man sat quietly, reading the menu with slow patience. Every now and then he looked around the restaurant, observing the room without any clear expression. After several minutes, he raised his hand slightly, signaling for service. One of the waiters noticed him but continued walking past the table, pretending to adjust a nearby chair. Another waiter passed by carrying drinks and did the same. Eventually, someone walked over and placed a glass of water in front of him, but the interaction was brief and distracted. The man thanked the waiter calmly. His voice was steady and quiet. I noticed something else then. His accent was different. Not heavy, but distinct enough that it did not belong to the city. Still, no one seemed interested in helping him properly. As the evening continued, other tables received quick attention. Orders were taken, wine bottles were opened, and plates moved constantly between the kitchen and the dining room. But the man in the corner remained waiting. I watched him fold the menu closed after a while, resting his hands on the table again as if he had already made his decision. Yet no one returned. The longer he sat there, the more uncomfortable the situation felt. Not because he complained, not because he demanded anything, but because he remained completely calm while the rest of the restaurant quietly decided he did not matter very much. And for the first time that evening, I began to feel that something about our judgment might be wrong. By the time the man had been sitting in the corner for nearly 15 minutes, The discomfort inside me had grown difficult to ignore. It was not that he had been completely abandoned. Someone had placed water on his table, and another waiter had briefly asked if he needed more time with the menu. But the attention he received felt rushed and distracted, as if everyone wanted to finish the interaction as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, other tables received careful service, wine recommendations, friendly conversations, extra attention. I stood near the service counter for a moment, watching the corner table again. The man remained calm, sitting with the same quiet posture. He did not wave for attention again, he simply waited. Finally, I walked toward Victor. He was standing near the entrance, speaking with another waiter while scanning the room the way he always did. When I approached, he looked at me with mild impatience. "What is it?" he asked. I hesitated before speaking. "The man at the corner table," I said quietly. "He has been waiting a while. I can take his order if you want." Victor followed my gaze toward the back of the restaurant. His expression changed slightly, but not with concern. Instead, he gave a small shrug. "He is fine," Victor said. "Someone will handle it." I remained standing there. "He has not ordered yet," I added carefully. Victor's eyes returned to me, this time with a faint smile that felt more dismissive than friendly. "You worry too much," he said. The other waiter beside him laughed softly. "It is just one table," the waiter added. "Relax." I felt my face grow warm, the way it often did when I realized I had said something unnecessary. "I just thought," I began. Victor interrupted gently but firmly. "Focus on your own tables," he said. "Everything is under control." The conversation ended there. I returned to the dining room, carrying a tray that suddenly felt heavier than before. My coworkers continued moving quickly between the tables, chatting with customers and delivering plates. The restaurant looked completely normal. But every time I passed the corner of the room, I noticed the man still sitting there. At one point, two waiters walked past his table while discussing another customer loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Some people come in and sit forever," one of them muttered. The other chuckled. "Maybe he is waiting for a miracle," he replied. Neither of them looked directly at the man. They simply kept walking. I told myself again that I might be overthinking the situation. The restaurant was busy. Delays happened. No one had insulted him directly. Yet the longer the evening continued, the more the quiet dismissal around that table began to feel intentional. The man himself remained calm, almost patient. He glanced at the room occasionally, watching the staff move around him as if he were observing something rather than experiencing it. And slowly, I began to feel a different kind of discomfort, not just for him, but for all of us. Because the longer he sat there in silence, the more it felt like we were making a mistake none of us fully understood yet. The moment that changed my understanding of the evening happened quietly. There was no argument, no sudden interruption, just a small moment that most people in the restaurant never noticed. Victor eventually assigned me to deliver another glass of water to the corner table. It was not a full service handover, just a simple task while the other waiters were busy. I carried the glass across the room, trying to appear calm. As I approached, I noticed the man holding his phone to his ear. He was speaking softly, his voice controlled and steady. At first I assumed he was speaking English, but as I came closer, the words became clearer. Italian. I paused for a fraction of a second before placing the glass gently on the table. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement, still focused on the call. "Grazie," he said quietly before returning to the conversation. I stepped back, but the language held my attention. I had studied Italian for several years when I was younger. I was not perfectly fluent, but I understood enough to follow a conversation if the speaker talked slowly. And the man was speaking slowly. Not because he struggled with the language, but because he spoke with careful precision. Certain words stood out immediately. Names, locations, short instructions. None of them sounded casual. His tone remained calm throughout the conversation. There was no anger, no urgency, no raised voice. Yet the way he spoke suggested that the person on the other side of the call was listening very carefully. At one point, he said something that made me pause. "Make sure everything is ready when I arrive tomorrow." The sentence itself sounded simple, but the tone behind it felt different, firm, quiet, unquestionable. The man ended the call a few moments later. He placed the phone down on the table and looked around the restaurant slowly, almost thoughtfully. For a brief moment, his eyes moved across the staff moving between the tables. I had the strange feeling he had noticed everything. Every delayed glance, every impatient sigh, every whispered comment. And yet his expression remained completely neutral. No anger, no frustration, just observation. I returned to the service station with the empty tray still in my hands. The waiters nearby were talking about another table, laughing about a customer who had asked too many questions about the wine list. No one mentioned the man in the corner. No one seemed curious about him at all. But my thoughts had already changed. Before that moment, I believed he was simply another quiet customer being overlooked during a busy evening. Now I was no longer sure. The way he spoke on the phone did not sound like a traveler making casual plans. It sounded organized, structured, controlled. I looked across the room again. The man had reopened the menu, studying it calmly as if nothing unusual had happened. From a distance, he still appeared like any other guest sitting alone at a table, yet something about him now felt different. Not louder, not more threatening, just heavier. And for the first time that evening, I began to suspect that everyone in the restaurant had misunderstood the situation completely. After the phone call, nothing changed on the surface. The restaurant continued moving through the evening the same way it always did. Plates left the kitchen, glasses were refilled, and conversations blended together under the soft lighting. But for me, something had shifted. Every time I passed the corner of the room, I looked toward the man's table without meaning to. He remained exactly where he had been before, seated calmly with the menu resting in front of him. He had still not ordered. Another 20 minutes passed. At one point, he lifted his hand again, a quiet signal asking for service. One of the waiters noticed him immediately. But instead of walking over, the waiter turned toward another table where a group of loud customers had just arrived. "They look like a good table," he said to another coworker while straightening his apron. Both of them moved in the opposite direction. I felt a tight pressure in my chest watching it happen. The man lowered his hand again without reacting. He did not complain. He did not call out to anyone. He simply waited. Victor passed by the corner table shortly afterward. For a moment it looked like he might finally stop. Instead, he slowed his steps just enough to glance at the man before continuing toward the bar area. "Still deciding?" Victor asked briefly without stopping. The man gave a small nod. Victor continued walking. The interaction lasted less than 3 seconds. Near the service counter, 2 waiters were whispering again. "Maybe he cannot afford the food," one of them said quietly. The other laughed under his breath. "Then he should have gone somewhere cheaper." They did not lower their voices much. Anyone close enough could have heard them. I noticed the man's eyes lift slightly from the menu. For a moment, he looked toward the direction of the voices. Then he returned his attention to the table in front of him. That was the moment I began to realize something else. He understood more than they believed, not just the tone. The words. The evening continued like that for another stretch of time. The louder tables received faster service. Wine bottles opened. Plates arrived quickly. Laughter filled the center of the room. Meanwhile, the quiet table in the corner remained strangely separate from the rest of the restaurant. It was not dramatic enough for anyone to confront directly, but the imbalance was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. I kept thinking about the phone call, about the careful tone in his voice, about the words that suggested he was someone used to giving instructions rather than waiting for them. And yet here he was, sitting alone in a corner while the entire restaurant quietly treated him as if he were invisible. The strange part was not his patience. It was the feeling that his patience was deliberate, as if he were allowing the evening to unfold exactly the way it was, as if he were watching something, testing something. Across the room, the man slowly closed the menu again and placed both hands on the table. He looked up toward the dining room once more. His expression remained calm, but the silence around his table had begun to feel heavier than the noise filling the rest of the restaurant. And I could not shake the feeling that the evening was moving toward a moment no one else seemed prepared for. By that point in the evening, the discomfort had become impossible for me to ignore. It was not just about the delayed service anymore. It was the quiet way everyone had decided that the man in the corner did not deserve the same attention as the other customers. The restaurant remained busy, but I could no longer focus on my own tables without noticing him. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour. No meal. No proper service, just a glass of water and a menu he had already closed. At one point, I saw Victor speaking with 2 waiters near the kitchen entrance. One of them glanced toward the corner table and smirked. Victor shook his head slightly, as if the situation was not worth discussing further. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I placed the tray I was holding on the counter and walked toward the corner of the room before I could change my mind. The man noticed my approach almost immediately. He looked up from the table with the same calm expression he had carried all evening. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Then I spoke. But this time I did not use English. "Buonasera, signor," I said quietly. "Good evening, sir." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. The man's eyes lifted fully to meet mine. For the first time that evening, his attention felt focused rather than distant. I continued carefully. "Mi dispiace per el adesso. Posso prendere il suo ordine adesso?" I apologize for the wait. "May I take your order now?" The silence between us lasted only a second, but it felt longer. Then the man leaned back slightly in his chair. "You speak Italian," he said calmly. His English was clear, but his accent was unmistakably Italian. "A little," I replied. For the first time, something changed in his expression. It was not a smile, just a small shift of recognition. "Interesting," he said quietly. For a moment, his eyes moved briefly across the restaurant behind me. I did not need to turn around to know what he was seeing. The waiters, the manager. The staff who had spent the evening assuming he could not understand them. When his gaze returned to me, it was steady. "You are the first person here who chose to speak to me directly," he said. The sentence was simple, but the weight behind it settled heavily in the quiet space between us. I felt my throat tighten slightly. "I am sorry about that," I said. He studied my face for a moment, as if deciding something privately. Then he opened the menu again and pointed calmly to one of the dishes. "I will have this," he said. I wrote the order down carefully, my hands suddenly aware of every movement. Before I could step away, he spoke once more, still in Italian. "You should not apologize for the behavior of others." His voice was calm, controlled, but the meaning behind the words stayed with me as I walked back toward the kitchen. Because for the first time that evening, I realized something clearly. The man had understood everything, every joke, every whisper, every moment of quiet disrespect, and he had allowed it to continue. The shift in the room was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was immediate. After I took his order, the man did not speak again for several minutes. He simply sat observing, with the same calm posture he had maintained all evening. But the energy around his table began to change, and I noticed it before anyone else did. A group of well-dressed men entered the restaurant quietly, moving with purpose rather than rushing. They scanned the room briefly, then approached his table. Their presence carried weight. Even the chatter of nearby diners seemed to dim as they drew closer. Victor's expression flickered. A small crease formed between his brows. He had not expected visitors. He glanced toward the table, then back toward the entrance, almost as if trying to read the situation. His earlier confidence, the casual dismissal, the smirks, the whispered jokes faded. The waiters near the service station stiffened. Some dropped the trays they were carrying, almost unconsciously. The louder tables suddenly became smaller in the background, their noise swallowed by the tense attention spreading across the room. Whispers began to ripple among the staff as they realized the quiet man was no ordinary guest. He greeted the men in Italian. Their response was calm but respectful, almost deferential. I overheard fragments, words of instruction, locations, confirmations, but nothing threatening. Just acknowledgement, coordination, and authority. The language was quiet, yet it carried undeniable weight. Victor stepped forward abruptly, the polite composure he had maintained for the evening replaced by tension. His voice, usually steady and commanding, now sounded uncertain. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, though it was clear he was unsure what he could do. The man's companion gestured briefly, indicating that everything was under control. The conversation remained calm, yet there was an unspoken understanding in the room. The quiet guest had influence far beyond what anyone in the restaurant had guessed. I noticed the other waiters stealing glances at him, their earlier laughter and casual arrogance gone. Even the staff who had whispered and joked about him earlier now moved with careful attention. Every small action, the placement of a chair, the folding of a napkin, the refill of a glass, was precise and deliberate, as though the restaurant had shifted to a new, invisible rhythm. The man finally looked toward me again, briefly, before turning back to his companions. His gaze was calm, but I sensed acknowledgement. The understanding that I had chosen to speak to him directly, to recognize him, had not gone unnoticed. It was a small gesture, but one that mattered. By the time the men left, the restaurant was quiet in a way it had never been that evening. Victor's posture had slackened slightly, the tension lingering in his shoulders. The staff avoided eye contact, no one laughing or whispering as before. The balance in the room had shifted permanently, even though nothing had been announced. The consequences were quiet. No confrontation, no punishment, no dramatic exposure, but everyone had felt the weight of the truth. The quiet man had revealed, without a word of anger, that the assumptions, the jokes, the dismissals, they had been mistaken. And for the first time, I realized that authority did not always need noise to be felt. The evening continued, but nothing would ever feel the same inside the restaurant. By the time the restaurant emptied, the air had changed completely. The hum of conversation was gone, replaced by the soft scraping of chairs and the distant clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. The man had finished his meal calmly, without raising his voice or making any scene. He paid quietly, leaving a tip that was neither extravagant nor minimal. It was precise, measured, deliberate, much like everything about him. Before leaving, he looked toward me once more. His gaze was steady, unreadable. "Crazy," he said softly in Italian. I nodded, words failing me. The staff moved around him as he gathered his coat, instinctively treating him with care now, but the lesson had already been delivered. No one spoke out loud. No one apologized. There was no acknowledgement beyond the subtle tension that lingered in the room. Yet the weight of what had happened pressed on everyone. Victor returned to his station, silent and withdrawn. The earlier confidence, the dismissive smirks, the jokes about accents and appearances, they were gone. The restaurant was the same in structure, the same in layout, but nothing inside it would ever feel the same. I collected the last empty plates, my hands steady, my mind quiet. I thought about the way the man had allowed everything to unfold without a word, observing without reaction, testing without threat. He had shown a kind of power that did not need noise or anger to command attention. When the door finally closed behind him, leaving the restaurant in silence, I realized that this evening had not been about service or tables or even disrespect. It had been about perception, about authority, about what happens when quiet strength meets careless assumptions. I went home that night carrying the weight of it quietly. There was no satisfaction, no relief, no revenge, just truth. And the understanding that some lessons, even when delivered silently, leave their mark long after the moment has passed. The restaurant remained the same the next day, as did the staff, but nothing about how we saw the world, or each other, would ever be the same.